Thank you guys all for joining this webinar. This is the second webinar in the series, the Reroute Webinar Series. First time that we met back in October, we talked about just overall how Reroute Consulting approaches change management and what our process looks like. Over the next several webinars, we're going to dive deep into how we actually break that process down. And I think one of the things that I myself have seen with webinars that sometimes frustrates me a bit is that we talk a lot about the theory and we don't really get a chance to talk about, what do we need to do, the so what, basically. And over the course of these next several webinars, I really want to dive deep into the so what. When we talk about preparing and planning for a change, what are we actually delivering? What are some of the things that I deliver to clients? And things that I think might just help you in just figuring out how to get started. And so I wanted to put these next series or these next webinars together to just kind of showcase kind of what we do, kind of pull back the curtain basically into kind of our how we do things. Few housekeeping items. So if you've never used Teams before, you've got the Q&A function at the top. So you just click the Q&A button. Chat has been disabled because there's so many people that are on the line here. We want to make sure that it doesn't get crazy. So we're going to focus on the Q&A portion section. Type your questions in. They can be anonymous. You can keep your you can not make it anonymous. You can also raise your hand and ask your questions live. We're gonna hold questions until the end of the presentation, and yeah, we'll just get started. So a little bit about me in case you don't already know. So my name is Andrew Ourique. I'm the founder and principal consultant at Reroute Consulting, and I've been managing change for just over 10 years now. And I've been working I've been running Reroute for 3 years. I've worked in a number of different industries, primarily within financial services, but I've also worked within healthcare, not-for-profit, professional services, to just help clients think a little bit differently about change. And we offer a number of services at Reroute. We do one-off workshops, and you'll see kind of examples of some of those workshops actually live today during the call. We've also do consulting. That's primarily what we focus on, so management consulting services. We do keynotes, and then a little bit of coaching as well, which we've been kicking off as of this year, and hope to expand out into the next year. But primarily our work is workshop and management consulting related. And essentially the approach here at Reroute really rests on 3 main pillars. It's that we try to foster a culture of compassion, adaptability, and accountability. And you'll see kind of how those are kind of reign true when we go through kind of some of the processes and the things that we do as part of the prepare and plan phase, just to make sure those 3 core elements are in place right when we get started. So just a summary, as I kind of mentioned, so some of the webinars that we've held already. So we had the change management playbook, which was an overview of the change management approach here at Reroute. Today, we're going to be focusing on the game plan, so the preparing and plan phase of that process. And then in 2026, we've got a few other sessions that we will be holding to kind of dive deeper into some of the other areas of the process, specifically the test and learn phase, and then how do we sustain and close the changes that we've implemented. So for today, it's going to be a little bit more demo rather than presentation, which I tend to prefer. But we will start with just kind of resetting and going through what our process here at Reroute is. And then we'll dive deep into kind of what we do to prepare and plan for the change. And then we'll end with the Q&A at the end. So for those who attended the first webinar, this will be a repeat. And for those of you who are watching this on YouTube, I'll put a link to that first webinar so you can take a look at that if you like. But essentially, we went into detail around what the approach at Reroute Consulting is. How do we manage change with confidence? Change complexity with confidence, and there are a number of different phases or phases to the process that we have. We've got the prepare and the plan, where we're really building the foundation for the change, readying the organization. We've got kind of a test and learn phase, which is that circular area in the middle where we test, evaluate, reroute as necessary, and then test again and on we go until we kind of meet the goals of the change that we're trying to implement. And then there's the sustain and close element of that as well, where we've launched a change that we're comfortable with, we feel like is doing what we expect it to do, but how do we sustain it once we leave, once the white glove service that we've been giving the change goes away, that we can actually realize the full benefits associated with the projects that we set out to achieve at the beginning. And so we will be breaking down each one of these areas over the course of this webinar, as well as the next two that we've got planned. But for today's purposes, we're going to really focus on the start, so the prepare and the plan phase. And this phase is really just about, and it's very much like it's coming from as a consultant. So in a lot of cases, I'm coming in not really knowing a lot about the business, not really knowing a lot about the team. So when I'm talking about prepare, a lot of this stuff may or may not be relevant if you are working on a change with a team that you are very familiar with as a change manager for that group. But everything that I'm talking about is you're coming in brand new. You don't know anything about potentially the business or the individuals involved. So you're really starting from scratch. Here is really where you're going to be focusing on understanding the scope of the change. You want to assess, the organizational context. And what I mean by that is things like, how has change gone with this organization in the past? Like, have they, done incredibly well with managing change? Is there a lot of scar tissue from past change failures? Were there change failures similar to the changes that you're about to introduce? Like, have they failed at an ERP implementation and you're trying to launch a new ERP now? That's going to have, implications different than if you're trying to bring something in net new. Are they very tech savvy? So are you are you a firm that is very keen on technology and innovation versus somebody that maybe is not, or a company that is not? And that will have different implications into how you manage that change. What are some of the key change drivers that you want to lean on, things that work within the organizational setting and the culture? And then you really at this stage want to kind of come up with an initial approach. This will definitely not be the approach that you move forward with, but the idea is that you're starting with something. You're wanting to get reactions from people, and it's better to start with the groundwork and then test, iterate, evolve. But you're really just kind of getting started with an initial plan. So in terms of this phase in particular, the prepare and plan phase, I'm breaking down to the actual deliverables that we deliver for clients. And so as part of these phases, there are 4 main deliverables that come out of this, and they define the why of the change, the who is changing, the what, and the how. So those get translated into what we call a case for change, which will go into all detail into each one of these in the next couple of slides. But the first is the case for change. This is the why. This is clarifying the purpose behind it. Like, why did we deciding to do this now? Or why are we deciding to do this in the first place? And why are we deciding to do it now? Which is really important clarification to make sure that we, not just the people who are going to be the end users, but we as a project team are aware of, so that we can kind of buy into it ourselves. The stakeholder map is the who. So trying to understand who is going to be impacted by this change, whether that's directly, indirectly, or just interested overall in the change, so that we can map out things like our feedback or our communication channels, so that we're hitting each one of those groups. This was actually one of the things that I always neglected early in my career, and have always made mistakes, as very easy mistakes, or simple mistakes that I feel like could have been corrected if I just had done this at the forefront. Things like just missing stakeholders in communications and not realizing that a whole stakeholder group was not receiving messages about a change. The things that can be very easily remedied by just taking the time to just understand who is going to be impacted by the change. And in some cases, that's really easy to do. In other cases, it's quite complex, involves internal, external government agencies. So it can be a very complex exercise. The change impact assessment, basically the bane of every change manager's existence, I think. It's a very cumbersome process, but I've tried to find a way to simplify that so that we can get as much of the initial information around the change impacts to help inform the change plan, so it doesn't just become an exercise where we're trying to deliver or trying to call out 100 rows in an Excel spreadsheet around like, they were doing this today, we're doing that tomorrow. And then it just kind of sits in a SharePoint site and collects dust and nobody ever picks it up again. So really trying to find a way to streamline that process, because it really is valuable to know, like, okay, there's a huge change that's coming up in terms of, let's just say it's in M&A, so in a merger and acquisition. You've got a company moving into another firm. They have different benefit packages, different HR policies. Maybe there's a big change in terms of like, it was a Canadian company that's going into, or sorry, is a company moving into another company where you've got like a tuition reimbursement policy, where maybe one company had a very lucrative tuition reimbursement policy and then the other one doesn't have any. It's a major change you want to capture and communicate. And so an impact assessment is really where you can do that due diligence, figure out the from to, and identify what's worthy of communication and what doesn't necessarily need one. Is training required? All of that kind of good stuff. And that is really important, help inform the change plan. So it's a key step. And then the how. So once you understand like who's who in the zoo, what is changing, the next step is to take all of that information and then put a plan together and say, well, we know we want to launch this change, September 1st. We know that all of these impacts are going to happen. How much time do we need to give for training to make sure people build up that ability with enough time to ask questions, test the system, all of that kind of stuff, so that we can launch this change effectively and just put something on the board. So let's talk a little bit about how we actually pull all of that stuff together. I think is really important to do. So I'm going to spend some time on each one of those deliverables and talk about what I actually do when I'm building this out. And it will go beyond just the PowerPoint and the Excels. And so I do want to share a lot of the work that we do within Miro and Monday.com, which I think just makes it a little bit more fun to gather this information. So the first thing is the case for change. And so what I'm showing is a rendition or an illustration that's inspired by Lean Change. If you're not familiar with Lean Change, I recommend taking a look at their site, leanchange.org. They got a lot of great templates and resources to kind of make change fun. Really is, I think, the easiest way to describe it. But this, you may have seen something similar to this before. It's, I don't think, proprietary to Lean Change. These canvases have existed for a while. I think the first time I saw it was within a business planning, business case sort of context, where they're trying to get away from, the Excels and the Word documents, the 10, 20, 50-page documents, to something that's a little bit more consumable and easy to fill out and easy to read. And so they kind of recreated that concept for change management. And what you see on the board is like all the information that you really need to get started with any change. You need to understand the vision, which is essentially where the why and the purpose for the change and the desired future state that we're working towards. Now, it's important to know like how you collect this information is so variable. I've collected this through like an in-person workshop, which I'll show some examples of. You can also collect this information yourself virtually through a Miro board. You can do it with a big group of people. You can do it with a select number of like functional group subject matter experts. You can do it one-on-one. You can have everyone jump on the board and fill in information, or you can collect this information yourself and fill it into the board and just share the final product. How you use it is really up to you, but the way to think about it is this is your blueprint. You use this change canvas as a way to inform all of the documentation that you're going to build as a change manager to support your conversations with impacted users, change champion networks, executives, whomever. But everything you need to know about the change is on this board. And we'll throw some examples of like what a completed board looks like and what the outputs can come from the information that you capture on this board. And it's also flexible. So if you want to start with, you start with the vision, but as we go further, you might want to jump to like one column for next and then, jump into another. So how you fill it out is also very flexible. And it's meant to be a continually edited document. If you remember back in the pre-COVID days when we actually were, more so in the office, you'd have like a board where you had sticky notes all over. that board would exist throughout the course of the project, and you'd continue to add, edit, remove. That's exactly what this board is meant to do. So it's very flexible. But you start with the vision. So you start with, the why are we doing this, the purpose for the change. Typically this is something that you can pre-fill as a change manager based on what you know, but you're also gathering feedback from, the subject matter experts, the business executives, like why are we doing this, and capturing that there. The goals you want to pre-fill here, and we won't get into a lot of information around goals and metric setting, but they are very important, and we'll probably maybe do another session on that. But that's what this kind of feeds into. So understanding what are the goals that you want to achieve in the short term, medium term, long term in order to realize that vision. So you want to capture those pieces of information there. And then the what. So like, what are you actually going to do in order to achieve those goals and realize that vision? And then, of course, the risks in doing all of that. And so really important pieces of information to capture. This is where it's in sequential order. I'm just going left to right, but again, it doesn't get filled out that way. Typically, I go to the stakeholders. Usually around this time, I think it just flows a little bit better. But this section here is just around the pain points. So if you're thinking about like, why are we doing this change? What are some of the pain points that we're trying to address and solve that this change is going to solve that exists today? And in terms of the opportunities, what are some of the opportunities that maybe were not available to us, but may be available to us now once this change goes into place? And you can start to see that this information, when you do this exercise, you can start to pull out to help inform communications that you do to say, okay, well, we've got this change coming up. Let's take a look at some of the pain points that we know this change is going to solve. And we can pull some key messages from here, as well as the opportunities. It's like, well, yeah, let's bring that out to show like what's the value at the end of the day for the users. And then some of the metrics. At this stage, when you're filling this out, you will have the vision details, you'll have the goals, you'll understand the risks. And so now you're trying to get to the point where you're like, okay, well, and the opportunities. Let's take a look at what are some of the metrics we want to track in order to make sure that we are realizing those goals. We're making sure that we've got an eye on the risks, and we're capitalizing on the opportunities that we've identified as well. The middle-ish part of the board is really where we get a chance to. These are kind of like, for me, these are more of like reminders, to make sure that I'm having conversations with people to identify like, how are we going to engage the target audiences? What are some of the resources that we can leverage in order to help support us throughout the change? And the reminders, is like the co-creation, the feedback, those two in particular. It's like, how are we going to co-create this change with folks? What are some of the ways that we can do that? Maybe there are sessions that already exist. In some organizations, I've had, I think they call them like a professional network of individuals who are like handpicked as being, executive bound or leadership bound that you can maybe leverage in order to kind of build your change out. So there may be opportunities that already exist that you don't have to create net new, that you're really just trying to get your stakeholders to provide feedback into, and then the feedback is just around like how are we going to collect feedback? Traditionally, it's surveys. It could be central inboxes. That could be change champion calls that you have. But there may be other things that others in the group may think that work within the context of that organization that you necessarily haven't thought of, because again, this is from a consultant standpoint, so external from the company. I myself don't know what the existing channels that they collect feedback in. So this I find is always helpful. Key messages. Tools and channels, I think, are pretty self-explanatory, but it's really going to help with the stakeholder mapping exercise to identify, okay, well, we've identified who these people are, but how are we going to deliver messages to them? So getting kind of an inventory of all the different channels that exist within the organization for this change will be really helpful to draw from, to say, okay, well, for this group of people, we want to use this channel to share information with. Resources are individuals, and so again, this is very early on in the project, so depending on when the change manager comes in, this may or may not be an exercise that needs to be done as a group. This may already be predefined. literally most of my cases, it's already kind of predefined aside from the change agents. But here is where you're kind of listing out like, okay, who's not only the sponsor, so the individual who's like, ultimately responsible for the project, but there could be folks that are, advisors to that sponsor or co-sponsors that we also want to capture in here. And while a lot of the times we feel like it's obvious, like, okay, we know exactly who these people are, we don't need to put it down, they do get missed sometimes, I will admit. And so keeping them down just to be like, yes, we've got to make sure that we're capturing these individuals, communicating to them like we would, for the sponsor themselves. It's just really important to do so we don't lose sight of it, especially when we get into like the execution side of things. Things are just moving so quickly. We tend to forget some of these, what we think are like common sense items. Core team, subject matter experts, and change agents. Again, a lot of this is for when the project just starts out and we're trying to figure out like who needs to be part of the team. It's not really something you do to just like put in if we know exactly who they are. This is really more brainstorming who are the right people to involve. And then the stakeholders. And this is kind of set up in a way directly and indirect impacted and interested, which will make a little bit more sense when we get to kind of some of the next slides. But this really helps delineate between like the type of information we need to deliver to these different groups. And a lot of folks, and myself included, get very mixed up with the whole idea of indirect and directly impacted. And so an easy way to think about it is, if we're dealing with a project like ServiceNow implementation, where ServiceNow is a ticketing tool that individuals will use. You'll call help desk. Help desk will create a ticket, and that gets tracked through a platform called ServiceNow. But if you were to introduce that change, where you're moving from, let's say, a legacy ticketing system or like an Excel-based system or whatever to ServiceNow, the directly impacted user group would be the frontline agents, the ones who are picking up the phone and taking the calls to track the instances, because their day-to-day activities are going to be impacted, who they go for approvals, what they need to do, all of that is changing. An indirect impact could be leaders, because now with a ServiceNow robust platform, you've got more real-time data. You can then leverage that to make more informed data-driven decisions. And so there is an indirect impact to them, because there may be more expectations on them now that we've got a more sophisticated system available for them to do what they need to do. But it's not like a guarantee. And interested is just, usually in this case, it's like sometimes it'd be government agencies. So if you're a bank, for example, it could be like a regulatory body. And so there are just a few, just capturing them here and differentiating them can be very helpful to just identify like who are our people we need to be the most worried about and spend the most of our time with. Now, that board itself, and you can kind of see here in this example, this is actually a board you can put in person. I find it's actually the best in person. And essentially, you're taking all of this information and you're going like line by line. And this is literally what that board was, verbatim. So, or each of the sections mapped to what we saw in the previous slide, all in here. And you just give people an opportunity to kind of fill in the information when you're kicking off the project. And it's a really great exercise. You end up getting a lot of great material that can be leveraged throughout the project. And when you're done, you get a board that kind of looks like this. Now, in that case, we were scattered. This client was scattered across Canada, and so we didn't have like one spot, one office room, boardroom that we were able to use for the project. And so a Mural virtual board was where we kind of extracted all of that information and put it up. But of course, if you have a room, you just keep it on the board and you continue to edit it as you go. But we kind of move this over into Miro. And in a lot of cases, this type of activity I do virtually, because the in-person workshop is just a little bit rarer. But Miro, I find, is great to kind of do this activity. And you can see this is actual real data from a client. And so you can actually see the amount of information we're able to get out from sessions like that. But I think the biggest question right now, that at least when I was initially shared this tactic, was like, this is great, but I can't really share this with an executive because I feel like they'd laugh me out the room, to be honest. But the important thing is it's not the, what it looks like, it's the information that is included in there that you can use in order to generate things that are a little bit more executive friendly. So for example, the case for change document here for a client was taken from information that we put together from that case for change, or that canvas that I just showed you earlier. An example is here as well. That was taken exactly from there. All these like streams of work came from the like, what are we going to do to achieve those goals? And so it's not that, at the end of the day, this activity is like, all right, you got this board, let's just share the link with the executive. Like maybe some executives would love that. And honestly, I would love to work with them one day. But most of the time, you're going to need to create a version of something that's a little bit more traditional. And that's what that board gives you. And so for us, it's what we do in order to kind of create that case for change for our clients. So the best part about this is, and you'll see that everything else that we're going to talk about starts from that change canvas board, because we've done a lot of this information already there. And so we can just feed it in to help fill in some of the missing pieces from a change asset, change deliverable standpoint. So when it comes to the stakeholder map, for example, we're taking that stakeholder column that we shared in the change canvas, and we're using that information to create something that is a little bit more user or a little bit more digestible for an executive audience or project team. So you can see here, and I'll show it in a little bit more detail, we take the information that we gather from the stakeholder column in the canvas, and what we do is we pull it together, and this could be in Excel, but I choose to use Monday.com because I think it's just a little bit more user-friendly and a little bit more flexible and a little bit more fun to use. And so essentially what we do is we take the information from that stakeholder list and we list out each of the stakeholders, and we provide information around that we're going to need to know about them that goes just beyond, the group name. So we talk about like how many people are, in that role as that stakeholder. Is there 2 people that have that role, 100, 1,000? How do we expect them to be impacted by this change in general? And a lot of different additional information around like what it is that we want to do to make sure that we're showing up for them. And the cool thing with Monday.com, or just a cool thing in general with doing it this way, is that you can create a lot of visualizations of the stakeholder data that most folks aren't really used to. What you see here on the bottom is a summary of the stakeholders in a quantitative way. And what this shows on the x-axis is the impact rating. So how impact are they going to be overall from the change? Now that impact rating depends on the organization, and it is usually similar but changes sometimes. But you've got that on the X, and on the Y, I add in perception because I think that's really important as well. Because if you have a high impact, but that's like a really good news thing, that's actually not as bad as a high impact and a negative perceived change. And so I want to call those out separately. Not to say that, there have been like changes that I thought were a slam dunk and they turned out to be more complicated and more complex than anything. But it is important, I think, to differentiate the two. And so you kind of create this like line almost where anything kind of below that line feels like you need to spend a little bit more attention to than the ones that maybe are above that line. So I find that visual is really helpful for me, just especially with limited resources, say like, where do I need to focus my time? And then from that, you can actually create like these really interesting visual representations of a stakeholder map that go beyond just like a table. And so here you can see you got the directly impacted, indirectly impacted, and interested. The size of these bubbles are the size of the actual stakeholder group. And the closer to the center they are, is the more impacted that they're going to be. And so this really neatly in one page kind of shows like this, who you're impacting. And in this change in particular, you can see that there were over 17,000 people that were impacted by the change in one of those 3 groups. It just hits different, when you show it in this way. Change impact assessment, like I said at the beginning, this is the bane of every good change manager's work, I would say. It can get pretty crazy. And so essentially what we end up doing is I will leverage all the information that I have as part of the pain points, opportunities, and that really helps get us started in terms of identifying like where are there big changes, because we've talked about, you know, the pain points being, you know, what are some of the pain points that this change is going to address. If this change is going to address it, that means there's going to be a change there, and so that's a really good starting point. And just start with those, and then once you start with those items, you'll be able to kind of double click into them and create a much more robust list of impacts. Now, the issue with an impact assessment, and why I say it's always the bane of a change manager's existence, is because it can get very long very quickly, especially when you're dealing with multiple functional groups where you're looking at impacts from an HR perspective, and then you're also looking at impacts from a finance perspective, and so on and so forth. And so it can get very messy very quickly. And so what I find the easiest way to do it is like, let's make the change manager be the one that has to worry about like the complexity. And when we're having conversations with the finance team, with the HR team, let's find ways to like filter that list down to only the stuff that's relevant to them. And that's what kind of setting it up, what I find setting it up at Monday.com is really great at. You can create dashboards that you could send directly to your HR teams with just the HR filtered stuff. You can do the same thing for all the other functional groups. But then me as the change manager, I can actually take a look at overall, what are some of the impacts, where are there cross work stream or functional group implications, and so on and so forth. You'll see there's also a perception rating that I add for the impacts. Again, I don't see it that often, but I think it's a really important addition, because again, a high impact change is can mean very different things if we're talking about something that people want to see or excited about versus something that people are very nervous about. So how we approach that is going to be different. Mitigation, and when are we launching the actual mitigation for that impact, I think is really important to capture as well, so that this change impact assessment isn't what happens with most of them, where they get filled out at the beginning of the project and then never get revisited again. This kind of keeps us on track of like, when do we want to launch these mitigating activities, and then a status of like when that mitigation is complete. Again, you don't see a lot of those two in impact assessments, but I always include them because I think it's really important, and it really helps inform the change plan, which we'll talk about next. Just a heads up, all that data is just dummy data, thanks to ChatGPT. So they're not client, it's not client data. But I wanted to pull in some data just so that you can kind of see what it would look like filled out. So let's talk about the change plan really quickly. Well, so this is another template that we use for the change plan. I think one of the things, before I move on to that slide, is I think the change plan, you know, trying to get started with a change plan initially is always, I think, the most challenging, because you're just like, I don't know, what are we gonna do? Where do we start? And so there is also a template that I use. And in the photos that you saw from that workshop, on the other side of that wall was actually this template I'm about to show you now. Again, it comes from Lean Change. I really like Lean Change from you know, the templates that they offer. I think they make it really easy to get some of the information that I found was really difficult to extract from stakeholders. So that's why you kind of see their resources here so much. But this is a template that they call the Big Next Now board, which I use all the time. And it's really, they've got a ton of boards, but these are the two that I use all the time, or as much as I can. You'll see here that there is a vision on the right. You go deliverables here, and then you've got this kind of next board, and then the now. What's interesting is this vision, you'll see, is very similar to that change canvas board. So again, we're not trying to like create new work all the time. We're trying to leverage everything that we've already done a lot of good work with. The change canvas work tends to be the, you know, along with this, is like, that's where the most amount of effort is placed. And so we want to be able to leverage that as much as we can. And that's why I really like these two tools, because I think it's the best bang for your buck. So you take the information we got from the vision around like what we're doing, why are we doing what we're doing? What is our vision, our end goal? And then you take the information around like what it is that we're actually going to achieve. And that's what goes into the deliverables. So This is what we're going to do. Throw it in there. Once you get the vision and the what, you spend some time to kind of like double click into this. Maybe there's more that needs to be done. And then the exercise is basically goes from taking what you have in the deliverables and starting to plant them onto the next. So working backwards, if this is what we're going to deliver, what needs to be done, over the next several months. Now you'll see here it's like 1, 2, and 3. It's right now it's just a placeholder. This can be phases of a project. This could be releases. It could be months. I usually use months. Most of my projects tend to be a waterfall in nature. And so you can really change this into whatever it is. But you're taking these deliverables and saying, okay, well, if I want to deliver this, what do I need to do? And then you're putting stickies in sequentially all the way from, to get you there. Now, this is kind of showing a simple version of it where it's just like one, work stream or one functional group. Typically, you'll have multiple functional groups there. You'll have a list of deliverables from IT, from HR, from why can't I think of anything else? Benefits, operations, communications, change management. So there'll be a ton of deliverables here, and each of them will have opportunities to take their stickies and figure out, okay, if I want to deliver that, what do I have to do between, for the course of the project, working backwards. And then the now bucket is basically just saying, okay, well, this is what we want to do. What can we do now after this workshop in order to make sure that we're ready to kickstart this project right? So it's a really dynamic, really interesting way to kind of do it. And this is an example of actually a couple of weeks ago where I did do this exact thing. So this is a Big Next Now board. As I mentioned, it's by month. And you'll see the what are we doing is listed on the stickies here. And this is as we were just kind of getting started. Now, you can see here a very thin amount of stuff that we captured, but you can actually see how much information we were able to capture from that after we did the exercise. Because you've got people in the room, they're all talking to each other. They're like, well, oh, right, well, if you got to do this at this time, that means I got to do this at that time. You'll identify dependencies really quick, really easy. And that's where these kind of lines kind of start to come into play. And it sounds like it wouldn't be effective. And that's literally how I thought when I first got this described to me. But when I actually did it live and in person or even virtually, you start to realize really quickly, you're like, okay, well, this actually works. And it's really valuable to just get you started, honestly. So this is actually what came out of that exercise. And then what we did there is we took all of the content from the mural board and we threw it into Monday.com to kind of create a change plan from it, which is what we will use, as our way to track in real time. And again, this is all just a starting point, but it gives something for people to react to. Now, the one thing about Monday.com, which I really love, is that they've got this dashboard. They've got notifications built right into the platform so that it makes it really easier to herd cats, I think that's the same for us. It also puts all of the information that we want all on one page. So from an executive standpoint, it's really helpful to just visualize what is happening and when. And there are different views that you can create. So an executive view, a work stream or functional group view, project team view, and so on. The view that I'm sharing here is more of a change manager view. This is a view that I kind of pulled together. So essentially here you've got, and it's so customizable, you can do it however you like, but this is kind of what, I pulled together, which is, overall for the project, where are we at in terms of completion? Again, this is all dummy data, so this is not real, but illustrates the point very well. So overall, how are we doing in terms of completion? What's done, work in progress, or stuck, and then not started? For the week, where are we at? On the right here, it's what are some of the items that are past due or stuck that we want to show visibility to, a Gantt chart around some of the change management activities, and then a summary of the impacts. So what are the impacts that we're tracking? What are their rating distributions? How many of it has been resolved to date? What's that stakeholder summary distribution? And what are some of the high impacts that we were tracking, and we call those out at the bottom so that we can make sure that we have them top of mind. Now, you can cut this data so many different ways. This is just one example of a way that is very quick, easy to just surface stuff that's really important. And Monday.com or other alternatives like Power BI, Airtable. I'm sure Salesforce, never done it before, but I'm sure Salesforce has applications for this type of thing. So their smart sheets probably might also have functionality like this. But Monday.com is, I think, by far the most user-friendly that I've used in the past. Now, what I've shared today is, like a simplistic kind of like example. These can get very complicated very fast. So you can see this is a copy of an output from a Big Next Now activity across multiple different functional groups. So it can get kind of crazy. So this is just one example of how complicated it can get. But to be honest, I can't imagine managing this project any other way than through Miro and Monday.com. I honestly have no idea how I would have been able to manage that on an Excel or a PowerPoint, just given how often these dates changed around. I feel like most of my time would have been spent just tweaking a PowerPoint slide. Well, to close then, I'll just kind of land here. So if you are looking at the templates that we showed and you're like, I would love to get started, but I don't have a place to start, we are putting together templates based on some of this stuff. There's still some updates that I still want to make just based on some learnings recently I've had. And so I will commit to kind of pulling that together and sharing that with the group who registered for the mailing list. So if you've attended the webinar, registered for the webinar, you're on the list. So you will get access to these templates, which we will be sharing early 2026 in January. So stay tuned for that so that you guys can get started playing around in Miro or Monday.com. Both of them have free accounts as well. So if you just want to go in and play around just for funsies, you can totally do that. You can put your personal to-do lists on Monday.com or in Miro just to kind of mess around with it, get used to it. That's literally how I started. And both of them have like really strong academies to help like learn how to use the tool. And so it's a really like user-friendly platform, both of them, and that's why I recommend them to anyone who's trying to do what they're doing. But they're not the only ones out there. There are a ton of other ones out there that you can use. These are the two that I just happen to find the most helpful. And then in the templates, so for Miro, we'll pull together kind of in one board, the strategic change canvas, that stakeholder analysis kind of view, kind of those bubbles, the Big Next Now activity, and then a placeholder for like a change plan that you can use and start to pre-fill. And then for Monday.com, that would be the content you would need to fill in to complete the stakeholder map, the impact assessment detail, and a place for the change plan. And yeah, the other thing is everything is very iterative. So whether you're working in an agile project or waterfall, it can work well for you as well. And I think in a lot of cases, Miro tends to be, especially for agile projects, the way to go, or some type of whiteboard. And so it's really helpful to like speak the language of the rest of the team. And so that's why I find these boards are really helpful, regardless of the type of project that you're in. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you all taking the time. I really, really appreciate it. And for those of you who are listening to the recording after the fact, thank you so much for listening to me go on and on. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me at andrew@rerouteconsulting.com, or you can follow me on socials. So you can find me on LinkedIn primarily, or also on Instagram and Facebook at Reroute Inc. So feel free to find me there.